Note: the following was originally found on an internet forum. The author is unknown.
Forward. With regard to my experiences of the last year, I've decided to summarize my unusual experiences of September 2020 in retrospect, to hopefully find some kind of peace. My documentation follows. 2nd of September. It all started here. The weather was pretty stormy at the time. Back at the beginning of September it wasn't particularly extreme though. I didn't have much to do then. Social life was limited, and I had quickly made a habit of spending my time either on internet forums or in the forest near my apartment. There really wasn't much going on then, until the second day of the new month, because after I had trekked out of the forest again, crossed the streets back to my apartment and finally went to bed, I had a strange dream. Well, I don't know how strange it was back then, but it was strange enough to stick in my mind more precisely than usual, and looking back, I can only guess that this was the first sign of something abnormal. To be brief, I dreamt of the forest. The same forest whose treetops I could see through the window of my bedroom. It was dark, but I could make out my surroundings as if it were the brightest day. I remember moving through one of the many paths, past trees and bushes that were too close together for me to ever see where I was. The forest was extremely huge, and I hadn't even barely explored every path back then. I moved along a winding route, even past a large pond on the side of the path, until I finally reached a dead end. Here, where the trees were much thinner, I looked around as if searching for something, before I saw something between the many plants. I can't exactly remember that first dream, but what I roughly saw was a small building, a cube of red brick. It was only a few meters from the edge of the path and was painted. Whether with graffiti or something else I couldn't tell. Mostly patterns of lines and circles. I have to mention, the dream was vivid, extremely vivid, and when I saw the little hut with its crooked roof, I could feel something. A sensation that I knew well. It was a heartbeat. My own heart seemed to be beating faster than I could have ever imagined. It felt like I was seeing something more frightening than a single mind could handle. It was a primitive fear, older than the strongest fear of the unknown, and even the indomitable fear of death. And then I woke up, on my bed, heart pounding and drenched in sweat. I already thought back then that the dream was special, but I wrote it off for the time being. 7th of September. The dream was special, but it wasn't the exception. It was the rule. On the nights that followed the second, the whole show repeated. Every night I would follow that one path in the forest anew, until I reached the end and found the hut. More impressions also became clear from night to night. After one night I was able to take my own steps on the forest floor. They were rushed and caused a splashing because the ground was apparently soaked, as if the monsoon had passed over my dream forest. After another I could hear and see the rain itself. Every night I would repeatedly wake up in a rush, feeling like I was running a marathon. I had to do something, talk to someone. So I did the only thing imaginable. I told strangers on the internet. As I mentioned, I regularly attended online forums, so naturally, I decided to share my own story there. I did so on September 6th, and on September 6th, I got the answer that turned the extraordinary dream into a real horror story. A user shared my experience. In fact, a complete stranger who, it turns out, also lived in my general area, had, according to him, exactly the same dream. Of course, he didn't see any relation to reality, as he didn't know my forest, which only made it stranger that he dreamt about it. At first, I was immediately ready to label him a liar. Obviously, he had only read about my story and was trying to scare me. But I soon had to doubt that. After just another sleepless night, 3 other people from the same area wrote to me and told me how they had experienced exactly the same dreams. None of them knew about the others, and until then they thought they were isolated cases. I asked them all personally when they first had these dreams, and was stunned when they all replied with September 2nd. What kind of Call of Cthulhu shit was this? That evening, despite having an uneasy feeling, I went back to the forest and even took a few photos before I turned back. The weather had worsened that week, and the rain was particularly heavy on the 7th, and increased by the afternoon. But I went out anyway. I don't know why, but I wasn't ready to admit that I was looking for the place in my dream. 11th of September. After another dream, the weather was almost as raging in real life as it was in those vivid nocturnal fancies. But I wasn't the only one looking into the dreams. The other 4 people from around here had also decided together to investigate the source of the dreams, and they wanted me to help them, since I mentioned in my story that I knew the forest from the dreams. And on September 9th, after the most recent dream, my interest, or fear, was kindled enough to join them. So we talked over the internet and decided that I would look deeper into my forest, hopefully to find the place that wouldn't leave all of our heads. So, on the afternoon of the 11th, I went back to the forest, where I spent hours. I reached my earlier turning point and stepped into the unknown. The further I went into the forest, the heavier the rain seemed to get. 100 minutes after entering new territory, it was an absolute storm. But I kept going anyway, driven by curiosity about what had barely let me sleep for 9 nights. I could keep my tiredness at bay, but I found little. I followed every broad path and every narrow passage until I reached a dead end, turned back and looked for the next. The forest grew thicker and the rain grew louder, but nothing brought back memories. I kept going though, partly because the thick trees above my head kept me from most of the rain, but there was hope. The thick vegetation around me gave me the slightest sense of acquaintance, and I knew that I was approaching something. Eventually, when my legs were exhausted, my clothes soaked, and the sun was almost below the horizon, I reached a wider part of the path I was currently following. It seemed to extend even further, where it was alternately wider and narrower, and more small clearings opened up. I was ready to turn back. The rain was heavier than ever, and I had no reason to believe that I would find anything else. I looked once into the distance of the path, the end of which could not be seen, and something struck me. It wasn't direct, it was more of an impression, something that struck my memory. The path seemed to deform in the far distance. It was less straight, full of curves. It reminded me of the path of my dream. At that very moment there was distant thunder, and I immediately decided to turn back, to return with my bike the next day and look further. I took one last picture and made my way back. It was only when I got home after nightfall and looked over my photos that I noticed something that I had captured on this last picture. I sent the other dreamers an enhanced version that night, and promised them to return immediately the next day. Whereupon I lay down to sleep, expecting another vivid dream. of September. The next day I got onto my bike early in the morning and set off towards the forest. I drove through puddles and wet earth. The previous day's rain had left its mark, but I didn't mind. I was curious about what I had seen in that photo. At some point, after many twists and turns and dead ends, I was able to make it out again. The path opened and became a small clearing, and this pattern continued until the path became curved and twisted. I got off my bike and followed it on foot, and there I made a strange discovery. There was a stone about 100 yards down the path, the rock I accidentally photographed the day before. The stone was full of strange engravings, none deeper than a centimeter. I couldn't see anything for sure. Most of the symbols were just lines and circles, but it seemed old, very old, older than all the trees that stood around me. I had never heard of anything like this in the forest, nor was I familiar with the history of the place. But there was something familiar about the stone. The signs didn't seem strange to me. The weather had worsened again by then, and after looking at the stone from every angle, I made my way to my bike and back home. Meanwhile, I recorded a video for the others to give them a better picture of the forest. But as I retraced the path, something happened that I only associated with these events in retrospect. I thought it was a wild animal back then, since I was quite deep in the forest. But now that I think about it, I can't remember seeing any living thing in the forest that day. I returned home without incident and shared my findings with the others. They agreed with me that I had to continue down this path. 17th of September. The days that followed the discovery of the rock were quieter. The others were as amazed as I was by the stone, and we did everything in our power to associate any meaning with the symbols, but we couldn't find anything specific. The dreams remained, and I would always be more aware of what was happening in my vivid dream world. One night I could swear to see a slight red glow from behind the dream hut, and in another I even heard hints of movement in the thicket around me. The days were just as subtle. I kept coming back to the path. Every day I looked at the rock and felt an acquaintance with the mysterious signs. I also repeatedly followed the path beyond, which still never came to an end, but the search remained fruitless. One day, when I was leaning over the engraved rock once again, it seemed different than usual to me, as if it had changed color. I quickly noticed that it was darker. In fact, almost no light seemed to fall on my surroundings, even though it was a bright morning, only darkened by the thick rain clouds. I didn't pay any attention to it at first, as the dense treetops were probably blocking out the sun, but then I remembered that the stone was in the middle of one of the clearings. My breath froze when I wondered, whose shadow am I standing in right now? I looked up slowly, heard a sound like rushing wind above me, and, as expected, only saw the cloudy sky. I thought it was all my imagination, mainly because the colors were normal when I looked down again, but I noticed at that moment there was no wind at all. The real breakthrough came 2 days later, on September 17th. It was a rainy day again. The puddles had been deeper than ever since the previous night, and only on the streets was the ground really solid. My bike moved reluctantly through the mud, but I forced my way past the trees with their dripping branches, still looking for an end to the path. I overtook the section that marked my turning point on the last evening and drove down the treacherous path. As usual, I drove as fast as possible through the mud, looking for anything that couldn't naturally belong in the forest. What I discovered after a mile or so was as natural as it gets, but it meant so much more than that. When I had made another bend, the forest on my left seemed to open up. A large area of little to no trees stretched along the way, and soon I could hear and see it. A large pond broke through the forest floor and grew wider and wider along the way. I immediately took some pictures to share with the other dreamers, because it was exactly this pool that I had seen before. In the last few nights, along the path in my dreams, I returned to show it to the others as soon as possible. To my horror, they all agreed that this body of water appeared in their dreams. It was getting too real for all of us. 24th of September. After I found the pond in the forest, it became uncomfortable. For the time being, I stopped any attempt to penetrate deeper into the woods. The others were as curious as I was, but they understood my fear, so I heard next to nothing from them. I still took my walks through the forest, but never nearly as far as the rock. I often heard movement in the thicket, distant screams that I explained as animals, or unusually loud wind currents over the treetops. But I didn't hear most of it at all over the noise of the rain, which had only increased over the course of the week. The dreams didn't let up, but they quickly became a chaotic, confusing mess, since the severity of the weather apparently increased there too. The trees themselves were blowing in the wind, and the rain came down hard enough to completely break through the canopy. During the day, my tiredness slowly drove me crazy. I could ignore it beforehand and distract myself looking for answers, but now I was alone again. From day to day, and from sleepless night to sleepless night, the thought only spread more and more that I could only return to normal when I finally find what the dreams want to show me. I didn't want it to be true, but something seemed to be calling out to me from the forest. It was on September 24th, a week after the investigation had stalled, when I finally decided to re-explore, hopefully towards a destination. I decided not to tell the others, I would only let them know if I discovered anything relevant. So, on the afternoon of the 24th, I got back on my bike and headed for the forest. The rain was back before I reached the engraved rock. I drove on anyway, but noticed something unusual. Or rather, didn't notice it. Nothing unusual was noticed. No inexplicable screams, no movements between the trees, no wind that sounds like the beat of mighty wings. Nothing. The forest had lost its unease. When I got back to the pond, I was convinced that the events of the last few weeks might have just been imagination and exaggeration. I stopped to look around the water. I parked my bike and walked along the edge of the pond. The rain had subsided, and I decided to film the forest and pond again in order to hopefully convince the others that we have nothing to fear. What I then recorded, however, only proved everything else, and made me flee the forest in a hurry. I don't know what I heard there, but now I think whatever it was just kept quiet, because it knew that I was answering its call. "29th of September. After the events of the 24th, I spoke with the others again. I shared the video I had made, and they all admitted that they couldn't find rest either. We discussed what we would do now, but no one wanted to consider or expect me to go further into the forest. One of them had looked further into the symbols on the stone I found, but the specific references to known characters were beyond old. The following days we talked regularly about how we could possibly find restful sleep, but it never led to anything. It increasingly dawned on me that we, or rather I, would need to find out what was hiding in that forest. So finally, a few days later, on the 29th, I sent my last message. I simply told them, I'm going in, and I'm not coming out until I find the source. I'm afraid. In case anything happens, you know where I went. Wish me luck. After telling them this early in the morning, I made my way back to the forest one last time. The weather was at its worst that day. The rain now mirrored the storm from my last dreams. The smell of wet earth hung in the air, and the noise of the rain pelted down on every roof. I crossed the barrier of the tree line separating the forest from the street, and immediately felt myself being watched. I drove through the mud and tumultuous downpour until I left the familiar part of the woods and the sight of the engraved stone entered my vision. I paid it no mind. I was too busy driving as quickly as I could, as I constantly heard noise just behind me, rustling bushes, the distant cries of animals, and the ever-present rush of wind. I tried to convince myself that the shadows I was seeing were only being cast by the storm clouds. Following the curving path as I had done so many times before, I soon reached the great pond stretching along the path, and for the first time, I kept going, into the unknown. I put the lake behind me, and soon the thicket grew dense around me. The path narrowed and the rain pounded louder onto the earth. I soon needed to slow down, just to keep up with the many bends distorting the path. And again, I noticed something. This time, it felt less like familiarity, and more like a memory. With every 100 yards I covered, it felt more and more like I had been here before, as if I had already tread this path. As I remembered, I stepped off my bike because I knew the path wouldn't go much further. Just as it had in my dreams. It was the same path, and I knew what I would find at its end. I counted my steps. 200, 199, 198. I was closer than ever before. I could still hear the sounds of hasty movement in the thicket. They seemed to come from everywhere around me. 106, 105, 104. The noise receded, either to retreat into the forest or because they had now overtaken me. Maybe I'd been expected. 23, 22, 21. I could see it. A few yards ahead. The path grew narrow, and the trees closed in. What remained was a dead end. The end of the road. 3, 2, 1. I now stood where I stood in my dreams. I looked around. Whether of curiosity or because the motion was memorized exactly, I do not know. What I saw was startling, but no surprise. To my left, maybe 20 yards off the path, stood a small building. A cube of brick with a slanted roof that channeled the rain. I saw the same strange paintings, which now reminded me of the engraved stone. It was the same building, the same one I saw in my dreams. Only then did I notice my beating heart, but whether this was because my dreams had suddenly become a reality, or a different, older fear, I couldn't tell. But there was a difference to my dreams. I was here. In every dream I would have woken up in this moment, but now I was really here, and it came to me to decide what would happen. I could hear something. It wasn't a noise or a voice inside my head, but I knew for certain that something was calling for me, drawing me near. It was old and hungry. It was actually with me. It had slipped past me. I had heard it, and now it was waiting for me. There, in its home. It offered me something. The truth. Answers to my questions. At least that's what I thought. And I only had to come to it. But I did not. I don't know if it was just fear, or I really did resist, but I managed to refuse its offer. I could be content with finding no contentment. That's what it wanted. It wanted me to give in to curiosity. With all willpower my tired body could muster, I took a single step back, and it knew I wanted to flee. I heard a tremendous rumble from inside the building. It carried a heavy echo, as if there was an unfathomably deep shaft inside. I was about to run, but a final idea came to my mind. Maybe I could at least bring something with me. So I reached into my pocket and quickly drew my phone, with which I quickly took a photo of the dream building. When a kind of door began to open on it, a red light shining from inside, I immediately turned and ran with all my remaining strength. Everything after that gets blurry. I remember my panting breath, many heavy footfalls through the mud and wet earth, and something that was above me or behind me, making sounds of rushing wind and casting everything in shadow. 198, 199, 200. I had reached my bike again and threw myself on top faster than I would have expected. After that came only frantic driving. I still held my phone and never got the chance to pocket it, leading me to take many blurry photos of the woods and the ground in my hurry. Suddenly, as I passed the lake again, I sensed the shadow descending above me, lowering onto the water beside me. I had not the time nor the strength of mind to look at it, but as I left the pond behind me, I felt it grow distant, and by the time I had passed even the strangely carved rock, I heard one last inhuman screech from the depths of the forest, the echo of which was soon drowned out by the rattle of rain. The way home is blurry, but I was there before sundown, and I finally felt no more desire to enter that forest again. That desire became a certainty when I looked at the photos I took that afternoon. Among them was a single, blurry, corrupted image of the lake, in the moment the object casting the shadow came down onto the water. I don't know if it's a tint from something below the water, or the mirror image of something above. I couldn't sleep that night. I didn't allow myself to. After all, I had no idea what I might see in my dreams, now that I had refused to heed the call. 30th of September. The nightmare wouldn't end. On the morning of the 30th, I had decided to at least reassure the other dreamers that I was fine. I sent them a single, "I'm back. There was nothing to be found. The investigation is over," and then stopped responding. I then spent my day as I would have before all this. Normal. I kept in touch with my actual friends. No great rushing wind, no shrieks coming from the woods, and only a little rainfall. in comparison to the storms of the days previous, until I went back to sleep. Late at night, I was ready to finally find the rest I had been denied. I was ready to enter the subconscious without any terrible visions, but that couldn't be. I dreamt again that night, but it wasn't a calling to go somewhere. It was a threat. I opened my eyes on the other side, and the weather was storming stronger than the highest of seas. The familiar and now feared rain effortlessly broke through the canopy and turned the ground into quicksand. I soon noticed the first difference. I was at the end of the path. It closed before me and stretched on behind me all the way to the horizon. I felt real. I could feel my cell phone in my pocket. Everything seemed even more vivid than before. I quickly looked to my left, seeing the building, but it didn't seem inviting anymore, just foreboding. It did not want me anymore. It only wanted to show me that I could never rid myself of it. The rest gets blurry again. I remember distant, heavy steps on stone, breathtaking fear, and a rattling at the building's door. But before something could emerge, I was blinded by something in the distance. I cautiously opened my eyes, and the sky was ablaze with a deep red light. This was followed by a scream, mine or not, I couldn't tell, the sensation of my phone in my hand, and an escape before I awoke, knowing what I had to do. 1st of October. The next morning was uneventful, and should have been the end of the nightmare. After all, I knew what I had to do. It was in the forest, and now it was awake and hungry. It had wanted to invite me, but I refused it. But I was not the only one to be called, and someone else could take my place. It would lend me no rest, and would always be with me, unless it could satisfy its hunger. I didn't know if it would be enough, but I had to do it. I shed no tears when I told the other dreamers, those who also heard the call, exactly where to find the building from our dreams, and promised them that they would find all answers they were looking for there. After that, I soon moved to distance myself as much as possible from that very building. I didn't regret what I did. I lied to them, but it was what had to be done. So the cruel dreams could finally come to an end. So the scent of rain and wet earth could finally stand for renewal again, instead of instilling fear. And so I could finally forget the one photograph, which I had found on my cell phone on the morning after that fateful dream.
Note: following the publication of this document, 4 people disappeared in a residential area surrounded by forest. These events are considered connected. These people were supposedly searching the forest for an unknown reason. A single handwritten note was found in an envelope near a scrap of clothing, presumably belonging to a missing person. It contained the following text.
To the dreamers, you know my name. I've finally found the answers. I need you here immediately. As you know, we've all seen it before, but we were wrong. We've all been there. They weren't just vivid. They weren't dreams. Come quickly to the forest. I will be waiting. Follow the main path for 3 miles. Then follow the path by the stone. It doesn't branch off. Follow it until you're here. All of you. We will be waiting for you.
Note: following this event, many residents of the area have been reporting sleeping disorders, specifically very vivid dreams, which have been described similarly by independent sources. The reason for this is unknown.